acknowledge that this meeting is being covered live by CTN and also on the state's Nonpartisan Commission on Women's Children's Services Seniors Equity and Opportunity Facebook page. Thank you to both for the continued support and work of this committee. And at this time, I'd like to conduct a roll call of our committee members. Carl Schitzel.
Present.
Welcome. Jackie Santiago.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome. Leonard Jihad. Ebony Epps.
Here.
Welcome. Chairman Woods.
Present.
I'll come over.
Yeah, welcome. Jeremy Stein.
Here.
Welcome. David Shapiro. And I believe we got a message that he may be a few minutes late. Dr. James Doddington.
Present.
Welcome. Dr. Charles Jandro.
Afternoon.
Good afternoon. Dawn Spearman. Deborah Davis.
Right here.
Welcome. Dr. Kyle Fisher.
Afternoon, present.
Good afternoon. Michael Muskowski.
Here, present.
Welcome. And Colleen Violetti.
Hi, here.
Welcome. Did I miss anyone?
I think you got everybody.
Yeah, thank you. And at this time, I'd like to show the minutes and we can go over them for approval. Andrew, would you like me to read some of these or just?
Yes, yeah, that'll be fine if you can summarize them.
Okay, perfect. So we had some action items from our last meeting that we had a public safety hearing that was on November 5th that Chairman Woods will share some reflections with us on. We have an upcoming public hearing scheduled for November 17th. From 5 to 8 p.m. We will still be accepting registrations up until 5 p.m. today, and we will be accepting written testimony up until the close of that hearing at on the 17th. Names of subcommittees that were formulated at the last meeting. Community Engagement and Public Health Work Group with co-leads Deborah Davis from Mothers United Against Violence, Michael Mukowski from Department of Public Health. The Policy and Funding Work Group co-leads with Carl Schitzel from Connecticut Hospital Association and Jeremy Stein from Connecticut Against Gun Violence. The third one was Evidence-Based Programming and Research Work Group with co-leads of Dr. James Doddington from Yale New Haven Hospital and Dr. Kyle Fisher from the Hobby. And a fourth work group of public agency work groups co-led by Jackie Santiago from Compass Youth Collaborative and a state agency that had not been named at that point. We reviewed the template that we'll be using for the final report and including sections, the following sections here: the origins and scope of the advisory committee, executive summary, background, purpose of committee, 5 legislative mandates, summary and conclusions, membership advisory committee, legislatively assigned staff, special acknowledgements, subcommittee work groups, appendices. And we had a great presentation from Mike Mukowski on Connecticut gun data from the Department of Public Health and Injury and Violence Surveillance Unit. Our future meetings were today and Tuesday, November 23rd, Friday, December 10th, and Wednesday, the December 22nd. And the announcements that we made, were identifying community. We had asked folks to identify community and public safety officials to provide testimony for the upcoming hearings, and compiling documentation for the final reports. Request from Force Chairman and myself to be present for all the work group meetings and provide recommendation on further data that was needed for Connecticut Department of Public Health. And our meeting was adjourned at 2:14 p.m. Is there a motion to accept the minutes as is, or do anyone see any changes that need to be made?
Motion to approve.
Actually, I have one addition. Pina, Jackie Santiago is now one of the tri-chairs of the Public Safety and Policy Funding Subcommittee.
Yeah,
That's
correct.
correct.
Yeah, and
Thank you for bringing that, raising that, Jeremy. We want to mention that as well. Jackie, want to thank you for willing to step up to the plate on that piece. One of the reasons that we all agreed to Jackie to becoming a part of Jeremy and Kyle Schitzo's work group as tri-chair was logistically, given our timeline, it was a little bit challenging to perhaps get the state agencies to be a part of this particular process. Again, logistically and given the timeline. And so one of the things we all agreed to and opted to do was generate a letter that both Kyle Schitzo, Jeremy Stein, Jackie, and others, we all worked on to basically send that off to the state agencies, many of them requesting information that includes data, that includes funding, sources that they might have, programmatic efforts that might be underway, and also what they envision might be some of the programmatic and funding approaches to addressing this work moving forward, especially in 2022. And so that letter has been finalized. We'll be more than likely getting it out on Monday.
beautiful. And we'll acknowledge that, Jeremy, in the new minutes for this after today. These were from on the 15th. We had not made that decision yet, so appreciate that. Do we have a second motion to accept the minutes?
I'll second it.
So Kyle, I have Kyle as first and Jackie as second. Thank you. And I'll turn it over to Chairman Woods for opening remarks.
Sure, not much in terms of opening remarks, other than to say that folks, we're getting closer. We obviously only had a short time to do the work that we're charged with doing, in less than 2 months, a month and a half, nearly, we'll have a report that we have to generate and finalize. And so I want to thank everybody for all of the work that each of you are doing inside your respective work groups. A lot of information is coming in, and that's going to help inform this particular report that will be going out. And I'm looking forward to it. I'm excited about what's coming so far. And again, that's a testament to each of you and all the work that you're doing. Today, we got some great guests that are on the lineup, and we'll talk more about that when we get down to presentations. But I did want to, and I'm not sure whether Senator Moore was able to make the call today. I don't think she's able to make it at this time. I don't see her. And so she's generally one of the few lawmakers that's able to make it, well, that attends live, if you will. And but certainly if she comes in, I'll acknowledge her presence along those lines. One of the things I did want to bring up was that we did have a very good and public hearing last week on November 5th. And I wanted to give members who were able to attend an opportunity to share any reflections on what they learned or anything that stood out, not only for those of us who were not able to make that particular meeting, but also the general public. So I did want to devote at least a little bit of time for us to provide any reflections on the testimony from individuals that spoke last week. And so the floor is open.
Hi, Andrew. This is Mike. One thing that came to mind, especially hearing from the chief from New Haven, he mentioned during the pandemic was a perfect storm, if you will, One, because of COVID, we were adhering to social distancing. So one, normal police activity was curtailed. Two, the court systems were shut down. So any arrests that were made, people weren't being processed to going to jail. And the other thing that was happening at the same time was the Department of Corrections was keeping to their plan and releasing people from jail. So it created a perfect storm of for homicide and crime to increase during the pandemic, you know.
Yeah, you're on mute, Andrew.
Thank you, Mike, for sharing that bringing those points up. I think that resonated with some folks in terms of part of that as being a part of the dynamic. And so other folks?
I think we heard some powerful testimony from individuals in the community that are doing some creative work around gun violence, including Swords to Plowshares and Sport Academy with Sean Reeves, that I think are things that we need to look to the future to expand and provide some funding to as well. And I would agree with you, Mike, the chief from New Haven, as well as both the lieutenant from Bridgeport and the sergeant or the detective from Hamden, I think were very powerful and surprisingly, gave some great, stuff around not incarceration, not putting people in jail. And I was pleasantly surprised by that, to hear about, other options that they see as relevant. And I also wanted to just share that we had a total of 13 people testify on the 5th, with 2 written testimonies submitted as well. We did have 4 more that signed up but could not testify on that day, just to give you some numbers.
Great. All right. I won't hold the floor open much longer unless we have a few other responses.
This is Charles Jandro. I really wanted to say that I was impressed with the police representatives that spoke and their efforts to really get into the communities for that prevention piece, which is very much important in my eyes. And it was great to hear that these programs, even through a tough COVID pandemic, when it becomes much more difficult to do those things, at least they were still brainstorming on ways to do them and performing them to the ability that they could during a difficult time. So now that we're on the tail end, hopefully, of the COVID pandemic, knock on wood, hopefully those programs will ramp back up and really cover our communities in need with proactive, preventative type programs. So I was very impressed by the testimony that they gave regarding that.
Okay, thank you. Ebony, Ms. Epps.
Good afternoon. What everyone shared was very important, but I especially like what some of the front line workers shared, the importance of us all coming together because we're all out here doing this work. And Ed Calderon said it perfectly when he said, when the FBI comes out, the CIA, they all come together, they plan, they have a task force, they come together, they plan, then they spring into action. And I think it's important for us to keep programs that are working funded, like the young brother who wants to do chess to teach kids lessons. The intervention piece is so important. I know in our subcommittee, Dawn often talks about, getting to the younger kids before the older siblings. So all of that stuff that the frontline workers were speaking about was important. And then what Akko shared as well is you know, the kids have time and they're bored. We have to keep things in place that we know is working and just come together and work together and make a difference in our community. So I was grateful to everybody who came on and shared, even the law enforcement officers that shared that they don't really want to lock them up, but they want to put some intervention practices in place. So it was a really great turnout. It was a great event, and hopefully we could put some of this hard work in these meetings into action.
Yeah. Thank you, Ebony. Any other hands? Jeremy.
Thank you, Andrew. I just want to echo what Ebony said, but also, you know, for those people that may be watching this hearing at home, of the importance of the hearing that's going to happen on the 17th, because, you know, we just saw a very small picture of the voices and the organizations that we need to be hearing from on this. So we encourage those people out there to please listen, because I anticipate that we're going to hear a lot more from groups just as Ebony had described, which is really critical for us to hear.
Good point. Thank you. Okay. Right. Going once, going twice. Right. Okay. Well, thanks, folks, for those reflections on last week's public hearing. And Jeremy, thanks for stressing the importance of folks not only tuning in next week, but also if folks can get a chance to submit something, especially in writing, by the close of business day on or by 3 p.m. on the 17th, that would be very helpful for our cause. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Pina for the announcements.
Great, thank you, Chairman Woods. For announcements, as we just mentioned, the public hearing is scheduled for November 17th from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. It will be virtual. We, as of a few minutes ago, have 36 people signed up to share testimony, and 5 individuals with written testimony to date. We will be accepting registration up until 5 p.m. or close of business day today for registration, and we will be accepting written testimony until the close of the hearing on the 17th. Oral report out of subcommittees work group findings will be presented at the November 23rd meeting. In your materials for today, there is a letter that explains that as well to all committee members. We will be looking for the policy and funding groups that are co-led by Carl Schitzel, Jeremy Stein, Jackie Santiago, and member Deborah Davis to present to us their findings on the 23rd. And you'll have about 30 minutes to each to present. The next group is evidence-based programming and research publications, co-led by Dr. James Doddington and Dr. Kyle Fisher. We actually just had a preliminary meeting an hour before this committee today, and really excited about some of the findings that they have come up with and will be sharing with us, including with member Leonard Jihad. The third group, and as Chairman Woods mentioned, we have folded in the state group into this sub-work group, and it's community engagement and public health, which is co-led by Deborah Davis and Michael Makowski, with members Ebony Emps, Dawn Spearman, and Jackie Santiago. And if I've forgotten anybody or missed anybody who are members of these groups, please let me know and I will make that adjustments for us. Some important dates to keep in mind as we're moving forward. The final written findings from the subgroups will be due to me and Chairman Woods by December 3rd. So you will be presenting what your findings are on November 23rd at that meeting, but you'll have till the December 3rd to address anything that was spoken about or requested from November 23rd. And we would like that the final written findings December 3rd. The first draft we are expecting to have to the entire committee of the executive report summary on Friday, December 10th. And then based on your feedback to us, we'll incorporate that and then provide you with a final draft of the executive report at the Wednesday, December 22nd meeting, which will be our official last meeting. And at that time, we will be requesting everyone's presence who can make it, please, because we will have an official committee vote on the final policy documentation that will be presented. For folks who absolutely cannot make it, we will keep open the voting till 3 p.m. On that date. But if we'd like to see our entire committee at that meeting. And then a final executive report to be submitted on January 1st, 2022. And at this time, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Chairman Woods.
Okay, thank you, Pina. Any questions, any thoughts, folks? Any reactions? All clear? Should have, some of this you may have gotten as well in the additional memo that Pina was able to get out to each of you with the minutes. Okay, let's go back to the second phase of our program, or this, is our presentations. And in the lineup today, we have 3 individuals, each of them in their own respective right, doing significant work, not only locally, I mean, nationally, but in various regions throughout the country. And first up will be Aswad Thomas, who is actually the National Director of Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice. And Aswad is also a Hartford native, who's now also Atlanta-based. And you're going to not only learn a little bit more about the work of Aswad himself, but also the work that he's doing and the importance. So each of these presenters, what they're presenting will tie directly to some of will help inform the report that we will be submitting to the state legislature. And so at this time, I'm going to ask Brother Aswad to come on in and do your thing. And thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you, Pina. Also, good to see some of you who haven't seen in a while, like you, Ms. Davis. Also you, Jeremy. It's always good to kind of come back home virtually to talk more about the work that we are doing at Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, and how we can better support crime survivors across the state. So as Andrew mentioned, I am the National Director of Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, which is a program of the Alliance for Safety and Justice, which I am the chief of organizing. First I want to kind of share like kind of what led me to do this work. I was born in Hartford, Connecticut. I was raised in a single parent home with my 4 older brothers on the North End, community that was riddled with systematic and personal barriers that didn't provide a lot of opportunities for young Black men like myself to really succeed in life. And growing up in Hartford, I was always surrounded by poverty, always surrounded by violence. And for me, at a very young age, basketball was that outlet that allowed me to have a safe space to go to in the community, and also knew that because of my talent on the basketball court, that it would one day lead me to a path of success. And basketball was able to do that for me. Back in 2009, I became the first male in my family to ever graduate from college. I was also a star basketball player on my way to play professional basketball overseas. So in 2009, was that highest point of my life. I remember, that day of graduation and seeing how happy my mother was, and seeing her youngest son graduate from college. And I also knew that, over these next few years of my life, that I would be playing professional basketball in Europe and being able to provide financial support to my family. But unfortunately, on August 24th, 2009, while I was back home in Hartford on Edgewood Street and Albany Avenue, I became a victim of gun violence. And immediately those bullets had ended my basketball career and nearly my life. And I remember being in the hospital. I went to St. Francis Hospital, and when the doctors there was telling me about my wounds and telling me that it was going to be a long road to recovery, but no one never told me about the psychological impacts of being a victim of gun violence. No one told me about the flashbacks and nightmares and the PTSD that I would go through as being a victim of gun violence. So they helped me deal with the physical pain, like through medication, but no one told me about the psychological impacts of surviving violence or having a loved one affected by violence. And so I was released from St. Francis Hospital back into that same community where I was shot with no support, no access to the victims compensation program. In fact, every time during my recovery, which was in my mother's one-bedroom apartment, recovering on that couch, suffering from 2 gunshot wounds to my back. I remember law enforcement came to visit me several times. And each time they visited me, it was always about the case. They never asked me how I was doing. They never told me about a victim advocate. They never informed me about the victims compensation program or connecting me to any victim services. And so my family and I was left to deal with that experience on our own with no help. And the only organization that came knocking on my door at that time, and I love you, Miss Davis, was Mothers United Against Violence. During my recovery, they held a rally for me. They was providing so much support to my mother at this time, who was distraught, who was going through so many emotions. And Mothers United Against Violence was the only organization that came knocking on my door, that came to visit me at the hospital, and was the only organization that extended their support to work with victims like myself, which they have been doing for a very long time in communities. And so as I was recovering, I started to think about, was I the only person going through that experience of being a victim of gun violence and not receiving any support? And so I started to kind of think about who else that I knew who were victims of gun violence. And so I called my father. My father, who also grew up in Hartford, he was shot in the 1980s in his chest. And I called him. I said, Dad, when you became a victim of gun violence, did you get any help? And he said, no. And then I called my second oldest brother, who's also a victim of gun violence. He was shot in his back as well. And I called him, asked him and said, hey, bro, when you got shot, did you get any help? And he said no. And then I called my cousin who was shot, who's as a result of that incident, he's paralyzed from the waist down. I asked him that same question: when you got shot, did you get any help? And the answer was no. So in my immediate family, from my father to my brothers to my first cousins, 5 out of 10 males in our family are victim of gun violence, and none of us received any support after those incidents. And so then I started to talk to my the mothers, right, the mother who have lost children to violence, and once again asking them that same question: when your family was impacted by violence, what support did you receive? And the majority of the time, the majority of the families who I talked to did not receive any support or services to help them heal. So I started to see like this trend of right there on the north end of Hartford, that so many families were impacted by not just gun violence, but domestic violence and sexual assault. But in our community, there wasn't a lot of resources and services to help people heal and recover from those incidents. But what really changed my life, and it's great to see you, Dr. Shapiro, who's part of my trauma team, who helped save my life as well. Great to see you, Dr. Shapiro. What really changed my life was actually at St. Francis Hospital. During my last doctor's appointment, Dr. William Marshall, my doctor at the time, he was performing kind of like the last procedure to remove the bullets out of my back. And as he's doing this procedure inside of his office and removing these bullets out of my back, he started to tell me the story about a young man who he had treated 4 years prior, who also was a victim of gun violence and was shot on the north end of Hartford. And Dr. Marshall started to tell me, this young man was 14. As a result of that shooting, he had lost sight in one of his eyes. And the more detail that Dr. Marshall started to share about this young man, my heart was beating fast. Because I was realizing that Dr. Marshall was describing one of the young men that had shot me at that time. And I remember telling Dr. Marshall this, and we just kind of like sat there in silence for like almost a minute, and we just looked at each other. And it's because we realized that that's how the cycle of violence continues in communities. Is that young man who was a victim of gun violence at 14 was released from St. Francis Hospital back into the north end of Hartford without any support. And I strongly believe that that played a huge role with me getting shot years later, because that unaddressed trauma, as we all know, often leads to further victimization, or leads to that person become a victim again as well. And so I started to think about, my basketball career was over, and so what else do I want to do with my life? And Pina, you can go to the next slide. So I started to share my story as a crime survivor. I started to talk with other community members and other organizations, and like how we can elevate our stories and experiences, but most importantly, how can we advocate for the resources and services that we need. And that's what led me to working with crime survivors for safety and justice. So crime survivors.
Oswald, you should be able to have controls yourself.
Oh, okay, awesome.
See? And if not, try it back.
Yeah, I don't think I can go to the next slide. But if you can go next slide for me, that'd be great. So Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice is a national network of over 91,000 crime victims from across the country who are joining together to heal, to share our stories, and to advocate for a justice system that prioritizes healing, prevention, and recovery. And the picture that you see on your screen here is a picture of Dr. Marshall. So one of those first days of him telling me about, about me being a victim of gun violence, and telling me, how difficult of a recovery it was going to be for me. But most importantly, how, the hospital was able to provide the support that I needed. But once again, once I was released, there was a gap in services. So the second picture is actually when I was able to, finally reconnect with Dr. Marshall again. Once again, St. Francis Hospital has done an amazing job of saving lives of their patients, but most importantly, wanted to address how can the hospital, how can the community ensure that all survivors are getting services. And so, that kind of led me to doing this work of working with crime survivors for safety and justice, where we have local members who are all survivors of different victim experiences, from gun violence, domestic violence, from sexual assault, who are really joining together to elevate the stories and experiences of what so many of us experienced across Hartford, across the state of Connecticut, and across the country as well. And so my story as a victim of gun violence, my story isn't unique. If you talk to community members across the state, they have been victims, and majority of them haven't received the support services to help them heal. And so that's what we do as an organization, of really organizing those crime survivors, to help change policies and to bring more resources in communities as well. So as part of our work, we've been able to make a lot of impact over these past few years of changing policies. And so through our work, we've been able to, secure about $500 million in state and federal funding to expand trauma recovery support services in those communities that are most impacted by violence. Those communities like the Hartfords, like the New Havens, the Bridgeport, those same communities are least supported by the justice system, are least supported by traditional victim services. So we've been able to kind of help, move more resources to invest in those community-based organizations to ensure that survivors get the support and services that they need. And also, we've been able to grow and expand our trauma recovery center model from one trauma recovery center in California. In California, now we have 39 trauma recovery centers across the country, and I have a section I'll go in depth about the trauma recovery centers in a little while as well. In addition to that, we work on changing policies as it relates to victims' compensation reform. We know that many crime survivors haven't heard of victims' compensation. We know many survivors who actually applied for victim compensation are getting denied at very high rates. So we work to change legislation in states across the country that include extending the time limit for victims to file for compensation. When I became a victim of gun violence in 2009, I didn't get made aware of the Victims Compensation Program until about 2013, and that was after my mom was able to, I think, if it wasn't you, Miss Davis, it was another of the moms as part of Mothers United Against Violence told my mother about that program. But that was 4 years after I became a victim. Because of the time limits in the state, I wasn't able to apply for compensation. So we work on changing policies and resources, policies and legislation related to expanded access to victims compensation as well. In addition to that, we do a lot of research. We do a lot of reports of surveying crime survivors, of surveying community-based organizations about their experiences with the justice system, and also offering solutions as well. So the next slide, you can go to Pina. The next 2 slides is in 2016. Yep, one more. Yep, one more. Perfect. So in 2016, the Alliance for Safety and Justice re-released the first ever survey of crime victims' views on safety and justice. So this was actually the first time where there was a national report that actually talked to crime victims on their views on safety and justice. Was the justice system working for them? Are you getting access to support and services? And so this report, which continues to show that we have a lot of work to do, especially in a state like Connecticut, to really address the needs of crime victims as well. So the next slide, Pina. And so when we talk to crime victims about, was the justice system meeting the needs of victims, what we found out is that 2 out of 3 crime victims who were surveyed received no help following incident. And once again, as I just mentioned, through my own personal experience and through my own family, that through my father, myself, my brother, my cousin, all of us are victims of gun violence and receive no help from the justice system after becoming victims. So this national survey really pointed out that 2 in 3 crime victims haven't received any help. And also for victims who said they did receive support, it was often from their local hospital, or it was from family and friends. It was not from the justice system. So 40% received help from family and friends, where 35% received help from their local hospital. And most important, I think one of the most important statistics that came out of this report, especially so relevant in Connecticut, is that the impact of violence on young people. Those, as I mentioned, those communities who are most impacted by crime and violence are the least supported. Young people who are impacted by crime and violence are the least supported as well. So this report also lifts up, who are crime victims, and often there are young African American and Latino men and women who are victims, but doesn't receive support and help that they need. So Peter, the next slide. So the next slide, once again, just get into more of what crime victims are saying about the impact of victimization. And so victims of violent crimes are 4 times as likely to who have repeat victimization. And so that's, when you talk to crime survivors, it's not just one experience of being a victim. It's actually multiple experiences that have occurred over months, over years. So we talk with a victim, a mother who have lost a child to gun violence. Often when you talk with them, you hear that, there were other victim experiences, right? From domestic violence, from a sexual assault that never went addressed. And so in communities, I'm just continue to think about Hartford and how we, really need to address gun violence in communities, but also we need to address domestic violence. We need to address sexual assault, because in community there are multiple victimizations, in one family. So this report really highlighted that as well. In addition, as you all know, especially you all who are here from the medical industry, that trauma can have a long-lasting impact on crime victims and their families. And in this report, 8 in 10 crime victims report experiencing at least one symptom of trauma. And then when we talk about, is the justice system meeting the needs of survivors, this report showed that only 1 in 10 people report receiving help from their district attorney or their prosecutor's office as well. Next slide. And these are just, I think you all have access to this PowerPoint, and I'll drop in the link for this national report, for you all's record as well. But once again, this is really lifting up what I continue to mention is that communities of color have been hardest hit by crime and violence, and their rates of victimization are highest for people who are young, Black, and that live in low income and resident areas, like the Hartfords, the Bridgeports, and New Havens, and in other areas across the state as well. Next slide. And so through our work, of talking with crime victims, we've been able to see consistent themes across the country, and so we was able to develop, a plan, some policy solutions to address the needs of underserved crime victims across the country. And while this is not a study, at least not yet, I know Andrew will do this at some point. This is not a study of crime victims and kind of talk about crime victims across the state of Connecticut. This is more of a national representation that also includes the experiences of our members who are from Connecticut, and also survivors in Connecticut who I've worked with, who I've talked to on a consistent basis on, what are some of the challenges, what are some of the solutions that they would like to see as it relates to addressing the needs of crime victims as well. So last year, well actually this year, released the first ever national victims agenda, which is a 10-point plan to address the needs of our nation's diverse victims of crime. So next slide, Pina. So in the National Victims Agenda, we wanted to focus on what were the consistent themes that we were hearing from crime victims across the country, and we kind of broke it into kind of like three key sections. So the first one here is expanding victims' rights. And what that means is that making the legal system work for and not against survivors of violence. And so we need to increase legal protections to prevent job and housing loss during recovery, so victims can actually recover from violence without worrying about where they will sleep or how they will make ends meet. And when you are a survivor of violence, often families have to return back to work the next day after burying a loved one, or have to return back their work while they are still grieving. So we need to look at policies that really help, as we have policies for domestic violence and sexual assault protections, we need to expand that to all victims of violent crime, so that they can take time out of work without fear of losing their job, and that can include paid leave or unpaid leave. But we really need to provide protections for survivors to go to the doctor, to go to appointments, to go to navigating the criminal justice system without having the fear of losing their jobs. In addition to that, we need also to make sure that all survivors have safe housing. When there is a violent crime that happened, just for example, if there was a shooting in someone's home, and for survivors, that is not a safe place for them. If that family is renting, a house or apartment, and that home is no longer safe, they may want to move from that location. But if they are renting, if they move and the landlord don't allow them to move, they may have to pay a penalty or forfeit their security deposit, or get evicted because they don't have authority to kind of break their lease to move into a safer location. So we have to look at policies to ensure that that survivors, especially survivors of gun violence, can safely move from a residence without having that penalty of breaking their lease or losing their security deposit, which could go towards another safe home in another community. So it's really providing legal protections, increasing civil legal services to help stabilize victims. Once again, if you survey crime victims in a city like New Haven or Hartford, most crime victims don't know that actual civil legal services exist for them. And so how do we continue to expand that as it relates to like awareness, but ensuring that all crime victims know about legal services and know about their rights will be important as well. And the third one under kind of expanding victims' rights is there's been an increase in violence across Connecticut and some cities, and we all hear about the rates of unsolved homicides in communities, and what we continue to hear from families that there often aren't hearing from the detectives who's working on their case. They're calling in to get more information. They can't get clear communication, and so survivors want information. Survivors want updates, and so we need to really ensure there's like dignity, respect, and support for victims of unsolved crimes, and often that it just includes communication with families and ensuring that those cases are still being worked on. I continue to hear that, especially in Hartford and also across the country, just the challenges in working with the justice system when trying to get information about cases or getting just clear communication. So that's kind of in the bucket of expanding victims' rights. The next slide, Patina, is about ending discrimination. So we need to expand victim services eligibility to all victims of violent crime, and also, as I mentioned earlier, I'm continuing to repeat this. There are already great services, protections for different victim experiences. So you look at domestic violence and sexual assault, there are a lot of statutes that are in place, but we don't see that for victims of gun violence. So we need to really expand a victim service eligibility to all survivors as well. That includes, ensuring there's equal access to the state's victims compensation and programs. That includes, as I mentioned, removing those barriers as it relates to the time limit to get people to file for compensation as well. And so it's really about expanding victim services and ensuring that equal access to compensation and services as well. And a third one, which I think is very critical, especially you go to the next one, Pina, in Connecticut, is that we need to ensure like more urgent help with less red tape. We've already seen just an increased amount of violence, in communities across Connecticut for decades. And with COVID happening, we have continued to see that increase in violence. But what's happened is that while there's been an increase in violence, organizations who are doing the work are often over capacity, can't meet the need, and survivors are not getting the help and support that they need. So we need to really reach more survivors in crisis and faster. So that means removing a lot of the red tape through a program like the Victims Compensation Program is more of a reimbursement type of program for families. And so we need to really look at how can we get funds out the door faster to help people pay for things like funerals and burials, and also help pay for basic needs, things like food, housing, clothing as well. We also need to make sure that we're covering the actual cost of recovery and extending those deadlines for help. The average funeral cost today, and don't quote me on this, is probably between like $9,000 and $10,000, right? In most states across the country, I believe in Connecticut, I think the expense cap for funerals may be between $5,000 and $6,000. Cost of therapy has went up. Everything has kind of increased, so we need to increase the expense caps to get people the help that they need. We also need to invest in more community-based victim service providers, that are doing the work, like the Mothers United Against Violence, the Hartford communities that care, and a lot of the organizations who are doing great work across the state of Connecticut have been doing great work for decades, but have been, grossly funded and under resourced as well. And so these are the organizations who are on the front line. Survivors are working in partnership with law enforcement, working in partnership with community-based organizations. I heard someone earlier said that the challenge we have is that not a lot of organizations are working closely together, and people are doing great work but aren't working together. I think that's because a lot of these organizations are not being invested in to do that work. When you look at the FBI, often when they are working together, that there are investments that goes to the FBI, that goes to local departments, that goes to CIA. So there's investments in technology, and services that allow them to work more closely together. We need to do the same in communities, invest in those community-based organizations who are doing great work and have better access to crime victims and families that help provide services. But also, those are the same organizations who are stopping violence from happening by conflict resolution, taking guns out of people's hand as well. We also need to ensure that there's more trauma recovery services that are widely available across the state of Connecticut. I know this is part of this committee is working on how do we address crime and violence. We need to make sure that all crime victims get access to support services as well. And I'll talk about the Trauma Recovery Center model in a few and how we can address that through that model. But we need to, I think Greg and Kyle would kind of really focus on the federal opportunities that we have. So we really need to fund urgent crisis needs now to help stop the cycle of violence and ensure people get access to the support and help that they need. And last but not least, I want to just have about 5 to 7 more minutes. I just want to share a video about our Trauma Recovery Center model, which is a one-stop community-based model that provides services to all victims of violent crime, and it reduces all the red tape. And so this is about a 3 to 4 minute video about the TRC model, and then I'll just go over more information about what the TRC model does and how it operates, which I'm hoping will be a model that we're able to bring to Connecticut. Pina, we can't hear. Pina, you might need to, if you can rewind it back, you might need to unmute yourself so we can hear the volume. Nope, still don't hear.
Can you hear it?
No, we can't.
Okay.
When you share video with sound on Zoom, you have to make sure your settings are allowing it.
My name is Aswad Thomas. I am a victim of gun violence. My life changed in a split second. While leaving a corner store in my neighborhood, I was shot twice in my back.
Being a victim of a violent crime is a life-changing experience. It doesn't only affect that particular victim who suffered that physical crime. It affects their mother, it affects their father, it affects their children or husband and wife. So it affects an entire family.
San Francisco General is a level 1 trauma center. The head of the trauma surgical unit, Dr. Bill Schechter, one day said to me, "We can sew them up, but we can't make them well." Crime survivors really need a whole array of services.
When looking at the Trauma Recovery Center, we saw a model that was reliable, was safe, that was evidence-based, that was the best practice, and the best model that could replicate across the country.
One of the more innovative aspects of this model is that it provides wraparound services. So we are providing practical assistance, case management, outreach, home visits, and mental health services.
Victims of crime that are brought in systems of care, like a trauma recovery center, are less likely to be victimized again. And unfortunately, those that are on the margins of society are at risk of repeat victimization.
The majority of the people we serve are people from underserved communities. We see victims of all kinds of violent crime, which includes victims of domestic violence, human trafficking, sexual abuse, victims of shootings, family members of homicide. We know that violence and poverty go hand in hand. I think it's one of the most important things that the Trauma Recovery Center does, that it removes barriers to care.
I think when people see TRCs popping up in their communities, I hope they see that here's a center that has my back if I'm a victim of a crime. Here's a center that has my family members' back if they're a victim of a crime, or my neighbor's back if they are a victim of a crime.
We have EMTs, we have police officers, we have firefighters. Now we have another first responder. We have trauma recovery centers to comprehensively work with the trauma that somebody experiences when they're coming out of a violent moment.
When we first started, there was only one trauma recovery center, and now there are 11. And it's absolutely a brilliant model. That, in and of itself, providing services in communities most impacted by violent crime, is prevention. A very beautiful, healing, uplifting form of crime prevention.
It's been a long journey to recovery. I think about the outcomes of what the possibilities could have been if there was a trauma recovery center in my community.
Wouldn't it be amazing if every single state in this country had a trauma recovery center? We can do more, we should do more, and we need to do more. There is so much more we can do, and I really believe that for sure.
Thank you, Pina, for showing that video. You know, the trauma recovery center model. You know, which you know, I think about my experience and if there was a trauma recovery center in my community, but most importantly, if there was a trauma recovery center for that young man who was at the age of 14 years old when he became a gun violence, there was a trauma recovery center there. You know, maybe I wouldn't be in front of you today. Maybe I will be ending my professional basketball career. And so I'm excited about the work that you all are doing. I'm excited about the opportunity to bring a model like the Trauma Recovery Center to Connecticut, because it really emphasizes a few key things. Assertive outreach. You must do assertive outreach to meet crime survivors where they are at, wherever in the community, whether it's in their home, at the library, at a homeless encampment. We must do assertive outreach to survivors to make sure they get the help that they need. We also need coordinated care for survivors. It could be very re-traumatizing to have to go to so many different community-based services and share your story over and over and over again. So if services are coordinated, then you know each crime survivor have a coordinator that they are working with to help them file for the victim's compensation, to help them connect to other services that are needed in the community. And most importantly, the trauma recovery center model is cheaper. I won't kind of share all the financial kind of details about this model, but it's cheaper compared to other community based services. And these are all services that are provided free of charge to crime survivors. And how we can bring a TRC and other programs like that to Connecticut and Greg and Kyle will go over this, opportunities at the federal level, but also looking at opportunities at the state level through the Office of Victim Services who oversee Voca funding to invest in these type of programs as well. So thank you all for the opportunity to be with you all today. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Right. As always, man, I appreciate you and the wealth of knowledge that you bring to the work and the importance of serving and supporting crime survivors. Can we bring it up to full screen, Pina? Because we also have some hands up for some questions, and we want to get a few questions in before we rotate off to our next speaker. But and then I have a few comments as well. But Jeremy Stein has his hand up.
Thank you, Andrew. Aswad, thank you so much for sharing your story. It's good to see you back in Connecticut. You know, I'm always just moved by your story about how not only just how hard it was in your recovery, but also the point of like, this is long-term trauma. Like this is something that you still struggle with, right? And so I want to thank you for the work that you do, the work that you've continued to do for Connecticut and Hartford and other communities. I have a question though, as as we've been talking in the subcommittee and policy and funding subcommittee, Carl, Jackie, and I, and Andrew Pina, we've been talking in terms of services in groups of, whether it's doing prevention or intervention or aftercare, and kind of, talking about the different levels of care or different types of strategies. It sounds like what you are talking about in terms of victim services is really in the aftercare section, right? So the shooting has to have happened, and we're trying to get care to those people after the shooting. But can you talk a little bit about how those services can also be preventive, how they can stop the shootings from happening in the first place?
Yeah, Jeremy, great question. So yes, so that's like, the basic thing that we should do is make sure people have access to services, because when you do that, that is actually a form of crime prevention. And I'm thinking about in Hartford, over this past few months, there's been a cycle of violence in Hartford with a close group of young men who have lost their lives, who have been impacted by violence. And through those incidents, how much victim services was provided to those families that could have resulted in saving lives. So why the Trauma Recovery Center must address ensuring people have access to services. It is a form of crime prevention, because when you look at people who are being victimized, as I mentioned, there are cycling in and out of St. Francis Hospital. You have that revolving door of someone who's been shot or stabbed, and years later they come back to the hospital because they was never got safe housing, right? To move out of that neighborhood that's no longer safe. Access to counseling, therapy, things that help them heal is, for me, and I think the research shows, is that when you provide services, you provide resource actually on the back end, it will prevent violent crime from happening again. So it's a two-part strategy, but it's really an emphasis on, hey, my theory is that if we can't prevent all crime from happening, the least we can do is to make sure that all crime victims have access to services and resources to help them heal, which in fact will prevent violent crime as well. So hopefully that answers your question, Jeremy.
Okay, thank you very much.
Right, Deborah Davis.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, and thank you so much, Haswat. This was an incredible presentation, and I am a survivor. I lost my son in 2010, and so I definitely realized going through the criminal justice system that the right minute we are sort of minimized throughout the entire process. And so I do see the real need, and that's what we do with our moms now through the criminal justice system. And of course, it is always at every level that we're traumatized. So even dealing with the prosecutor in the state attorney's office, they sometimes really minimize you. And even though you are a survivor, a victim. And so it is so many levels of trauma going to the hospital, every area that you just talked about, a lot of the moms and family members have experienced it. And so those areas are sometimes never looked at, especially going through the criminal justice system. It is systemic inequities. And so we see it specifically with our underserved community, because they are sometimes very much ignored. And so oftentimes, myself, Raymond Brown, and a lot of our folks in this work, we have to speak up for them. And so one of the areas that I certainly do think that we should absolutely embrace is certainly that area. That's just another level. I mean, that trauma initially, like you said, going through the hospital. So I definitely agree with the fact that our criminal justice system and the systems throughout care in the hospital, how you're treated in the hospital, what access you have, and then what attention you get at the hospital. And I've seen a lot of moms get rejected, totally rejected, just in terms of their asking questions. And those are some of the things that I know that we have to continue to look at. And I thank you for that presentation. That was right on point.
No, thank you, Ms. Davis, for all the work that you're doing and being there for my mother, and continue to be there for my mother as well. So I know we'll be talking soon, but most important is like, how do we embed survivors, in decision making, in policy at every level, which will be critical for us in Connecticut.
Okay, I think we got one more, Jackie.
Hi, thank you, Aswad, for that wonderful presentation. I think it just highlights the complexity of violence in our communities, and you did an amazing job and do great work. I've had the privilege of hearing you now twice, and so I thank you. I'm Jackie Santiago, and I work with Compass Youth Collaborative, and we're interrupting incidences of violence in the community as well, and providing case management to victims of violence. And my question is almost twofold in that I want to learn more about how the wraparound services work for the victims of violence once they're released from the hospital. I think oftentimes the difficulty is the connection points, and you mentioned a little bit about how difficult the partnerships can be. And so I'd like to hear from you, your perspective on how that works well for you.
I think that's an entire another day that we could spend just on that part of the work. But most importantly is the coordinated services. And so, right. So making sure, I'm going to just bring up my experience, right, of me coming in contact with St. Francis Hospital and being discharged and not connected to any services in the community. And so the model of the Trauma Recovery Center is like working in partnership with the hospital, working in partnership with law enforcement, working in partnership with the Office of Victim Services, working in partnership with organizations like yours and Mothers United Advice and Harvard Communities That Care and other organizations to ensure that there are coordinated services. So you have to create a web of services for survivors and ensuring that who's the main point of contact once this family leave the hospital, and helping to connect them to other services in the community will be important. And I'll drop in some links about the TRC model. I put it in also some of that in our presentation that I didn't go over, so you all can also review as well. But that's the important strategy, is like linking people to systems of care after they come in contact with the hospital. But also I want to lift up, majority of crime victims don't come in contact with the hospital, right? So how do we ensure that there's a community center where people who have been a victim of domestic violence or sexual assault can just walk to that community-based organization, knock on the door, I've been a survivor, and you're going to get access to mental health services and other support, which is also another level that we need to chat about at some point of people who don't come in contact with current systems.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. Dr. Shapiro.
I'll be brief because Aswad and I go back a long way, a long time ago. He looks exactly the same though with that beard, so I'm happy to see him on here. I also was I experienced Aswad's first presentation about this, or an early one, back in our conference room right across the hall from me. So it's nice to see that work is progressing and how much you've done to impact your community and all of us. The thing that I'll mention most importantly though is every other specialty in, whether it's surgery or cancer or other disease processes that are out there, everyone has a support group. Everyone has a network of people that are helping them. And if we talk about treating gun violence like a public health problem that it is, we need to start recognizing that the people who are victims, the people who are families, and the people who treat them all need to come together to help those victims survive and recover. And those people who are left behind after they go are the ones who need the most help in most situations, because they don't have any. And this type of model is exactly what we're looking for. So it's impressive to see it grow. I've seen programs in a variety of cities around the country. And as Aswad may remember, my partner, Schuster Christie, was from San Francisco General. I think you knew that. So he's now retired in Florida, living the good life, but he'd love to see this too. I'm going to tell him that I saw you today. So thank you for that.
All right. Okay, Brother Aswad, thanks again, my man. And we'll be in touch as always, and look forward to seeing you with the Brother Cow Institute.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, you got it. The next up is Greg Jackson, the Executive Director from Community Justice Action Fund, and he'll be discussing and sharing with us the role of community violence intervention strategies and some of the federal resources that are available for those that do this work and are looking to get into providing services and supports to reduce and prevent violence in our communities. Brother Greg?
All right, good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Maybe a thumbs up or down?
Yes, sir.
Awesome. All right, well,
Awesome.
thank you. Well, I'll dive straight in. I'm Greg Jackson, Executive Director for Community Justice Action Fund. Unfortunately, similar to Mr. Thomas, I'm also a survivor of gun violence. I was shot in April of 2013. And again, very similar to Mr. Thomas, I didn't get a lot of support beyond the medical support. And frankly, the medical experience was equally traumatizing as being shot. You know, when I entered the hospital, I was interrogated in the emergency room before surgery by 3 investigators. Even though I was a bystander, I was treated as a suspect and a criminal. And that in itself was extremely traumatizing. And the bullet that struck me hit 2 arteries. And so I was suffering from pretty intense blood loss. And when I actually met my surgeon, he said I only had about 26 minutes to live coming through that. But thankfully, I navigated through this criminal justice system, or whatever we call it, and survived that act of gun violence. But coming out of it, grew very committed to furthering policy and strategies to address gun violence as a whole. When I was shot, this was 2 days after the failed Senate vote on background checks. And a couple things stood out to me. One was how congressional members and leaders in Washington were talking about this issue like it was just another political topic to pass around and debate, and no, we'll come back to it later, which for me was mind-blowing, because I'm in the hospital, you know, fighting to recover. And I know that so many other folks didn't recover or impacted, and that this is not a political issue. This is life or death for us in our communities. The second thing was, not only were they treating it like a political football, the entire emphasis was on gun control and frankly, gun access, but totally overlooked everything else that goes into a comprehensive strategy to address violence. And so I came out of that hospital room with the belly full of fire, trying to figure out how to make some change in this area and really start to reverse this tide of violence through policy, but also through real strategies. And so I spent a couple years working in DC government, helping to design and implement a lot of their strategies to address violence. Some worked, some didn't. But from there, just learned a great deal. Sadly, in 2019, the summer of 2019, one of my childhood friends was shot and killed in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I quickly saw the very big contrast between a city like DC that's trying to create and design a comprehensive strategy, and a place like Greensboro, North Carolina, which only saw it as a law crime control issue. And that's what motivated me to want to get deeper into the federal side of the work. And so that's just a quick intro to myself and what brings me here. I'm hoping I can kind of dive into a little bit of how we see the crisis at a comprehensive level, and then share some of the federal strategies and progress we've made, and how that should connect and can connect to what's happening in Connecticut, no pun intended, and definitely open up to a few questions. So let me just get my slides going here. Cool. So just a little bit of background about the crisis. I think this is really important to level set. More than 100,000 people are shot or injured by guns every year. When we look at the homicide rate specifically, 74% of homicide victims in 2019 were Black or Latinx. That number has actually surpassed 80% when we looked at the 2020 numbers. And we also have seen that gun violence is spiking in Black and brown communities. But in parallel with that, police violence against Black and brown communities has spiked, and the high profile incidents have become a more common thing for our community, sadly. We've also seen a huge surge in violence against women, violence against the LGBTQ community, particular transgender women. And one thing that's not on the slide, but we're seeing a stark increase in suicide in Black youth. But lastly, I always bring it back to this because I think it's important for all decision makers to remember, is that this has a real fiscal impact on our economy. And in our country, we lose $280 billion every year when you look at the economic impact of gun violence. And that talking point and that specific fact is what we use everywhere nationwide, and especially when engaging federal leaders in the White House and Congress, because we know that our economy is a big priority in our country. And if it is, then that 280 billion should be a big enough fact beyond the 100,000 to get people to take action. But thinking about the solutions, we look at it in three major ways. There's the intervention work that can be done to address this crisis. And that includes community or hospital-based violence intervention. It also includes survivor and victim service, like Mr. Thomas was sharing, and healing and trauma services. But there's also strategies to address the risk factors that lead to violence. A few that are listed here, including like strategic workforce development and addressing firearm access and malicious acts. And then thirdly, addressing the root causes that increases the risk factors that lead to violence. And so we see that the comprehensive strategy to ending violence includes some of these short-term efforts, but also the long-term efforts about addressing housing and environmental issues, addressing economic, educational, and social inequities, but also putting a strong emphasis and investment in addressing and repairing, if you will, the physical, emotional, and mental wellness damage that we've seen play out in communities suffering from violence. But just to talk specifically about violence intervention, which is kind of that triage approach, right? The most urgent Band-Aid we can put to save lives now. We are strong proponents of strategies that focus on community violence intervention and prevention efforts. And to simplify it, these are programs that focus on those who are most at risk. The reason for this is because we've seen in most major cities that have done research on why and where violence comes from, that less than 2% of the population are connected to 80% of the violence. And when you do social network analysis, and I'm not talking Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, I'm saying when you look at peer groups and families and the social network of those individuals, we can actually predict 60% of the violence that happens in any major city. One of the biggest predictors of that is, has that person been personally injured or injured by violence within the past 5 years? And we know that 40% of those folks that commit an act of violence or become a victim of violence was connected to some direct situation before, as Mr. Thomas already highlighted. So these CVI strategies focus on engaging those who are most at risk, but understanding that this population is the hardest to reach without targeted strategies. It's not enough to just have a kickball program or to have a job employment program. To get to those who are most at risk, you have to have targeted strategies that appeal directly to the situation that they're in and provides resources and results that are impactful to navigate individuals out of those situations where they could become the next victim or they could become the next offender. So what are these strategies? There's a lot of them, but there's a few common ones that we point to, which are evidence-based models. And there's a huge debate about, okay, do we need to be evidence? Do we have to have a college research every single program? Not necessarily. I mean, there are strategies that have been researched and evidence-based because of that research, but we've also seen that there are models that are what we call evidence-informed that are able to lean on some of the practices of these well-resourced strategies and have still seen similar results. But these are just four major examples when we think about community violence intervention and prevention strategies. One is the community and hospital-based programs that focus on directly intervening interpersonal or group conflict. We have one in my neighborhood that, just to give you an example, there were two feuding buildings, right, or communities in two buildings 2 blocks away, like literally 3 blocks down from me. And our violence intervention program went and met with one group, went and met with the other group, and tried to fact find, okay, why is this beef happening? Like, why are people still going to war? What can we do? What needs to be changed and addressed? And ultimately, they found that the beef was so far in the past that most people that were a part of it didn't even know where the original conflict came from. And you had this tension, almost like two soldiers in war, where I've lost a lot of people and you've lost a lot of people, so we continue to fight. But what they found is that when they talked it through, there was a lot more in common than there was in contrast between those individuals. And there was pain and trauma on both sides, but it had gotten to a point where both sides really wanted to end the conflict, but just didn't know how. And so this group again, met with each of those individuals, the violence intervention team, and eventually it took 10 months, brought them together in a room with no firearms, no violence, and allowed them to talk it out and come to that peace and that ceasefire in that community. And after that, we went through about 2 years of no violence in my neighborhood because of that negotiated ceasefire. And so that's what these community-based violence intervention programs can do at an individual or group level. Hospital-based programs, which you'll hear a little bit more about later, concentrate on engaging folks in the hospital when we know the emotions are highest and the pain is the most intense, but engaging people in that very critical moment to hopefully reduce the chance of retaliation. Victim and survivor support services, you just heard a whole presentation on how impactful they are from Mr. Thomas, but that's one of those evidence-based models that we fight and advocate for. There's also cognitive behavioral therapy programs, and these are programs that engage those who are most at risk proactively and provides a full wraparound strategy to help them shift their mindset. I was able to participate and support one of these programs, and we covered everything from life skills to effective parenting, to job skills, to credit repair, to conflict resolution. The individuals in our program had weekly therapeutic sessions with the trauma therapist, and they were able to get through their emotional challenges, their traumatic challenges, but also their physical challenges and their family challenges that all provided more stress and frankly, conflict around, which would have potentially led to violence. And we found folks who got their GEDs, one bought a house, another had a better credit score than me by the end of it. Some of them regained custody of their children, started their own businesses, now are leaders in government. One works for the Attorney General's office I believe he's an associate director now. And so we saw that once you invest in these individuals and help them shift their lifestyle, there's a great deal of potential that exists in those who are most at risk on either side of the gun. There's also a ton of studies around youth employment services and programs that target those who are most at risk and brings them into an employment or internship environment. And these are critical because that's a entry point. When you know that someone young is looking for a job or struggling to survive or support their family, getting them resources and employment is a good entry point. But then these programs, which makes them special, is that after they have that entry point, they're able to apply the wraparound services and strategies to help them shift their lifestyle and join in with us in a much healthier, beneficial future. And whether that's therapeutic services, whether that's housing relocation, programs that combined employment with a wraparound strategy of other services have seen great promise in reducing violence. So those are just a few of the evidence-based models. There are more out there, but I wanted to just give you some high-level highlights. I have a few slides about examples of those who are doing really well. I'll try to just point to some of the key resources for success. When you look at the community or street violence intervention programs, they're very dependent on having credible messengers and individuals who have relationships or lived experiences that connect with those who are in the middle of conflict. But when that's done well, they've seen great reductions in violence. But one of the challenges is that there's every city you go, there's all these interruptions in funding. You get a reduction in violence and they say, okay, we're good. Well, no, this has to be an ongoing presence that individuals have. It's also very geographic oriented. And so you may have one neighborhood that's doing really well, but the neighborhood next door could be suffering if you don't have the scale that you need. So there's just a couple key things, lessons learned from community and street violence intervention. I'm gonna skip over hospital-based because I think Kyle will talk a little bit more about that. But a huge success that I point to is that we found that participants are 6 times less likely to be hospitalized or suffer subsequent violent injury after participating in these programs. There's a direct correlation in the results if we invest in folks in their hospital experience. Cognitive behavioral programs, which I spoke about before, in certain cities they've seen, I have 50% here, but one has actually seen 60% reduction in gun violence by really honing in on that 2% of the population and providing them with those strong resources and academic and fiscal support. One of the key resources for success, while these programs can be voluntary, we found that the ones that are most successful have some form of financial incentive, whether that's for participating or reaching key milestones. But that's been a great tool to keep people engaged and keep these programs keeping their cohorts strongly focused and moving along. But there is there's also the political and sometimes the media spin on that about incentivizing someone for good behavior that can make it challenging. There's also a heavy investment needed in interagency support for individuals. Typically, someone that's a part of these programs has a plethora of challenges that they're facing. And so if you can't have a strong intergovernmental or mixed use community support, then you may miss their need and may be ineffective in supporting them as they're making this transition. Again, you need housing support, you may need education support, you may need childcare support, you may need therapeutic and trauma support. And if that's not available to individuals in these types of programs, it could suffer immensely. Survivor support, I don't have to talk a lot about this because Mr. Thomas went in depth on this. But if I can just back up for a second, that's what those programs are at a glance. We have successfully made this case to all levels of government, and the president acknowledged on December 21st of 2020 that this is a public health crisis. And it is something that requires a public health approach. And on April 12th of 2021, in his first series of executive actions, he announced that they're taking steps to confront not just the gun crisis, but what is actually a public health crisis, and starting to really strongly invest in some of these efforts. Just a couple highlights. He adjusted the eligibility for 26 existing grants across the federal government. They totaled around $12 billion. I had 10 plus here, but we did a new tally, so around $12 billion that can support these efforts. He proposed $210 million to be in his fiscal year 2022 budget, which we're still waiting on Congress to figure out. He also committed $5 billion in his Build Back Better Act, which was formerly known as the American Jobs Plan, which is heavily being debated and discussed right now in Congress. But he also released the American Rescue Plan guidance from the Department of Treasury, Department of Education, to really encourage states and cities and counties at all three levels to invest in some of these strategies, acknowledging their great impact and their great ability to reduce violence, but also that this is directly connected to the COVID-19 crisis, and acknowledging that as COVID-19 intensified and the impacts on our economy and our housing and our education system, we saw a direct correlation with the increase in gun violence. And because of that, the president stated very clearly that he wants states, counties, and cities to use these resources to also address the crisis of gun violence in parallel to COVID-19. And then he also launched the CVI Collaborative Project, which brought in 16 philanthropies across 16 cities to get some of the nonprofit space beyond the activists and organizations like myself and our fellow presenters, but to get some of these big philanthropies to pour into these strategies and support the development and growth of these types of strategies across the country. We've also seen, in response to that, historic investments across the country. I mean, I know Connecticut obviously made a strong stride forward and was actually one of the first, if not the first states to step up. But since then, we've seen a lot of other states jump in. District of Columbia, I consider them a state, but because I live here, committed $193 million. New York, 138, New Jersey, 45. Tennessee committed $10 million today. Newark, New Jersey committed 15 million, and the list goes on and on. Philadelphia, 155, Miami, 8 million, Columbus, Ohio, 19.7 million, Baton Rouge just announced 2.5 million. And so we're just seeing communities and cities and counties across the country stepping up to invest in victim services, to invest in intervention programs, to invest in these proactive CBT style programs, but most importantly, to invest in community and people-focused strategies to address violence. And so I think those are my major highlights. I kind of already talked through this, but the way ahead, I will just say some of the big battles we have is that we are still pushing to get the Build Back Better Act passed, which includes those historic $5 billion. There are multiple bills in Congress that include different forms of funding, including the Break the Cycle of Violence Act. Individual members of Congress have also advocated for their earmarked funds to go to these strategies, 21 million in total across the country, and again, the federal budget. Lastly, I'll just say, there is a lot of talk about these strategies nationwide. It's been in ABC and NBC and CNN and Politico and Washington Post almost weekly. But what is very clear is that these programs work, that they're impactful, that they save money, and most importantly, they can save lives now. I think it's really important to acknowledge we are in a world right now where our communities and our country is saturated with firearms and saturated with guns. You know, I was shot by an illegal firearm. One of my mentees was shot and killed by an illegal firearm. And these are in communities that have limited access to quality education, to equitable housing, but firearms are here. And of course, we need to take long-term strides to address this crisis of gun violence, but we have to recognize that our communities are already saturated, and we have to put as much energy and focus and resources into helping people heal and navigate and avoid conflict that turns fatal as we do implementing new laws, pushing for more policing, pushing for stronger sentencing. A lot of the, cracking down long-term access and the impacts of violence needs to be prioritized just as aggressively as the short-term strategies that we know work and can invest in people and save lives today. And so I'm just excited to be a part of this movement and this effort alongside our fellow presenters and everyone on this discussion. But hopefully this was a helpful kind of overview of what's happening, what can be done, and what we're fighting for. So thank you.
Right. Mr. Jackson, it was a pleasure meeting you several months ago and also working and being a part of the network that you also lead. But more importantly, those of us that do this work at the grassroots level, we really appreciate your leadership at the White House level and the work along yourself and your colleagues have been helping us, helping us to even frame the argument in ways that policymakers can understand, and the importance of getting those resources down to the grassroots level and those of us that do this work. So we do have a few hands, and I'm going to go to Jeremy Stein.
Hey, Greg, good to see you. Welcome to Connecticut. I want to echo also what Andrew said. Look, congratulations on taking over the helm for CJF. What an amazing organization, and what in a way to help refocus what gun violence really looks like in the United States. And I'm proud to be working with you in the Invest in Us Coalition and other weekly meetings. You talk a lot about, well, let me back up for a second. This advisory council is charged with the task of advising the state legislators about the formation of a commission on gun violence intervention and prevention at the state level. I know that places like New York and Wisconsin and New Jersey and Texas and others have done this already, right? And they've taken the guidance of the president and others and have done this at the city level and the state level to form these offices of gun violence prevention to do the kind of work that you just described. Can you just reiterate, or at least go into a little more detail about why the formation of such offices at the state and city levels is so important?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we need a federal one too, frankly. but what we found is that there's different models that exist, right? And a lot like what Mr. Thomas was sharing as far as victim services and how important it is. And there's so many advocates that are like violence intervention is so critical. What we found is that the cities that are most successful have a system in place where they have victim services that are in cahoots or connected with the violence intervention programs, whether that's in the street or in the hospital. And then they're able to refer people to a CBT program to help them shift their lifestyle. And that's also connected to a youth workforce or adult workforce program to help them navigate into, a new job. And we also know that, hey, the victim service program may need to, in order to save someone's life, relocate them out of housing, right? And that may not be renting, that may be public housing. We also know that what happens at communities can spill into the school system. And so having that coordination from the community to the education system is critical. But if you don't have someone leading that charge and owning that process, it will never be a strong system. And in every system, in every city that does this well has created an Office of Violence Prevention that can hold agencies accountable, that can make sure that the Employment Services has a set number of training spots available for those impacted by violence. Is someone who mandates that the hospital program and the community programs work together, right? And that type of coordination is extremely critical. At the local level, it's a little bit more tactical. It's like making sure these people are working together. At the state level, it's more about coordinating your funding and your resources and making sure the dollars are being broken out in a smart way. But the way that we end violence is a comprehensive strategy. Like this is a public health crisis. And I always remind people, when you look at like COVID-19 or the opioid crisis, you know, they didn't just throw some money to like one like hospital or behavioral program. No, it was a whole comprehensive strategy that was created, and they hired someone, a czar or a director of health or someone to own that process. And it's the same thing with violence prevention and intervention strategies. You know, it's one thing to focus on legislation. It's another thing to implement programs and push out dollars. And an entity that can manage that will be way more effective than kind of clumping it into another department. We've also noticed that if you put it into justice, there's a huge focus on the crime control lens, which can be not necessarily destructive, but as I don't know if I shared this before, but the Violence Policy Center did a report on Black homicide, and they found that 68% of homicides in the Black community are not connected to another felony crime. And so that means 2/3 of the homicides are not connected to the criminal world, the gang world, the drug world, you know, whatever else that you know, law enforcement and the justice system are hyper focused on. So you're going to miss 2/3 of the problem if you just go DOJ. If you just go Department of Health, we found that there's also a huge gap, because this is a whole new world of engagement that frankly, Department of Health haven't engaged beyond hospital work. A lot of hospital-based work is not reaching out and engaging the community proactively. And so there's a learning curve there as well. And so by creating an office that can long-term develop this and make sure that those two worlds are playing a good part in scaling out, but that you're also holding other agencies and different funding sources accountable, it's critical. And I will say not a lot of states have gotten their state offices set up yet. I think we're at 6, I believe, across the country. So there's still a lot of room to grow. But I also know Connecticut, y'all love leading the charge. And so I'm excited to see you pull it together. So thank you.
Thank you, Ray.
What I will say, one more quick thing, in Maryland, they didn't create an office, but what they did do, they created an advisory council at the state level. And it's a makeup of community leaders, hospital leaders, health leaders, law enforcement leaders. And that group actually oversees the development of the strategic plan. They oversee the grants, but most importantly, they're the ones that assess the performance of the organizations, and they report back to the state legislature the progress, what's happening, what worked, what didn't work. And so if you can't get an office built, I mean, building together some type of council of folks who are really committed can definitely, you know, hold it together until you can get a strong team to work on it, you know, 24/7.
Deborah Davis.
Thank you. And thank you, Greg. Thank you for that presentation. We just talked about this yesterday as it relates to organizations coming together at the federal, or really at the state level, but we were talking about the different components that need to be involved in Department of Education, Department of Juvenile Justice, all of those entities coming together, and public health, all of them actually, and even our Department of Children Family Services, because there's a lot of different activities that go on with our young people, and sometimes those agencies are definitely connected. We actually even discussed some of the ills of the educational community and how that impacts our children in school, and how sometimes that actually leads to other things outside of the school system. And those things can be definitely implemented with a social work or a mental health person inside the school, helping to mediate some of those issues that our kids do come home with. But more importantly, and I was just going to say, on the sustainability side, which I heard so much in terms of helping these moms and these families get to the next level, even after they go through trauma. I know I needed it. a lot of mothers and family members and young people that want to go back to school, vocational, and that's how I know we have to tie in the educational system as well, making all of those areas available. So I like that about that plan. What's your thought on the sustainability component of this entire, this is an epidemic.
It is. I think you're spot on that we can't, this is what I struggle with a lot in our advocacy work, is that quick story. 2019, we had the first ever hearing in Congress on urban gun violence. And a lot of the advocates couldn't be there because guess what? Down the hallway was the first ever hearing on school safety for gun violence. And the fact that we had those hearings at the same time blew my mind. Because to me, there's no divide in these two worlds. You know, children who struggle in school and drop out become parents, right? And individuals that are struggling as adults have children. You know, one of the closest people I worked with in our CBT program had 11 kids. And so I'm like, man, I'm not trying to save you. Yes, I'm trying to help you shift your lifestyle, but that's 11 families, 11 individuals, 11 futures. I mean, that's a whole nation of people. If you look 3-4 generations down, I mean, that's a lot of people. And so you have to think about how do we help people, but never divorce the two, that education and youth engagement does not connect to adult engagement and community engagement. And so I do think they need to be closely tied together. A lot of our violence intervention programs are creating youth branches that work directly with kids in the schools who are also connected to the adults. And then we also can't overlook the mothers and the partners and individuals. You know, right now, gun violence is the #2 cause of death for Black women. So this is not something that is purely impacting Black men, but we also learned that if we don't have, let's say we are focusing on 10 Black men, the first thing we learned in our program is that how are they getting to the programs? They're getting dropped off by their loved one, which is their girlfriend or their mom or their aunt or their grandmother. And we're like, if we're not engaging the individual and their social circle and their support network, we're missing the mark. And a lot of times that is women, right? And so a lot of these programs are scaling out to make sure that they're hyper-focused on those directly engaged, but they also have a component that helps the youth that are connected to it and also the loved ones and significant others as well. So I'm sorry, I know that was a little bit of story, but I just want to reinforce that it does need to be all connected.
Absolutely. And I like that story because it is very real. And just to point out in your part of your introduction in terms of discussion, two individuals or individuals living in two buildings that are very close together in terms of 2 or 3 blocks away, that's cyclical gun violence. That's how that happens. And I know Jeremy had said, well, how do we prevent? Some of these folks, they really just know each other. They really know each other. And you could be on the next other side of the street, which is incredible on one side of this. And so some of it is territorial, some of it is so much, but it is, and that's part of that root. And that's where we just had I think it was a cycle of 4, I believe, Andrew, that they all knew each other. Mm-hmm. And that's how those 4 occurred, which was just, unthinkable, but it's real. It's very real. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
Of course. And you know what's amazing about, I'm sorry, go ahead. Excuse me.
Greg, I want to hold you there. I got Jackie Santiago would like to one question, and we're actually running up on that 3 p.m. time. And we want to try to squeeze Kyle Fisher in here. So Jackie?
I may need to just reach you offline because I think the question that I have is a little more involved, but I think the world of partnership and the importance of working together because we are stronger together when we can all play a role very well. And it's also the most difficult thing to do. Oftentimes we have data as the way to kind of measure impact, but a lot of agencies, especially community agencies that are not well funded, do not have capacity for that. And my question is, what are some data points that have been used in community agencies partnering in multi-sectors in order to improve the work and build coalition better?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I can definitely share more details offline. But that's one of the biggest challenges with these type of strategies. You know, law enforcement, they can say, we arrested this many people. We got X number of guns off the street, you know, and that's very concrete. Whereas what we're measuring in most of these programs are lives saved. And sometimes that's not necessarily seen as exciting or as positive of a thing. You know, you can say a number of shootings, but if you could turn around and say, hey, we had, you know, 200 participants in this program, and, you know, 180 of them completed the CBT program of 6 months. That's a great measure for success if you know those individuals are most at risk. Same thing with victim services, looking at the treatment received and completed. Those are huge. Ceasefires negotiated, just like the story I shared that Deborah referred to between two individuals who had a conflict. That's a real metric you can share. But I will say there's a little bit of challenge there, and I think this is really good for this committee to work on, is making sure that you are defining metrics for success that are not just simply, has the violence gone down or has the shootings stopped? Because a lot of this will be long-term. You know, a conflict you resolve now or start working on now may take 2 years to resolve, and you may lose lives in that process. But I think you have to push them to rethink the metrics around success, to focus on lives saved and the health and wellness of individuals who are at risk versus how many caskets rolled through here. Because we know unless those root causes are shifted, which is a much bigger project, then you're going to see a spike whenever there's any major impact economically, any major impact financially, or impact on the housing market. If a specific public housing is torn down and you scattered individuals who are at risk, let's say there's 20 in that building, you've scattered them across the city, then you're probably going to have a whole new series of challenges ahead of you. And so if we just focus on the shootings and the lives lost, I think we're overlooking the metrics of success. And so I will say Voca in Baltimore and Boston has done a really good job in their specific metric system. Safe Streets Baltimore has done a great job. And it also reinforces the importance of creating an office, because that entity can help develop those metrics and consistently present those to government officials in a way that, you know, they're excited about, just like the crime stats and other tools. So hopefully that's helpful, but I can definitely dig in more. But thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure meeting you.
All right. Thank you very much again, Greg, and I look forward to following up with you as well. Okay. I did notice that Senator Moore has also joined us, and glad she's able to spend some time peeking in and getting a greater sense of some of our national players and the work that they're doing and how they're going to help us inform this project, this plan. Kyle Fisher, you're up. Health Alliance for Violence Intervention.
Thank you, Andrew. Let me pull these up, and I know we're on a near time right now, so I'll try and be brief so we can get through Friday here. Greg I predominantly wanted to talk about funding opportunities that are coming through and available, because that's the perennial question. Greg has already covered some of the big things that are really important, between the potential $5 billion community violence initiative in the president's plan, if it comes through, to be determined. He talked a bit about the funding coming through with the American Rescue Plan and the cities, counties, and states that are using that. And then he also mentioned some of the congressional earmarks that I know that some of your representatives and senators in Connecticut have already used. So what I'd like to do is kind of fill in the gaps with some of the things that he's talked about, so we can, nothing we do is free, so we got to figure out where that money could come from to support the things that the committee thinks works. So I have as the big highlights the federal community violence grant programs and some of the changes to the Victims of Crime Assistance Program that recently came into law. Funding opportunities through traditional health insurance through the Medicaid program, which Connecticut is in the process of doing right now. And then I have a few slides on some kind of out of the box thinking of funding that's coming through through the federal infrastructure plan that perhaps we might be able to think about utilizing in their strategic ways. So I'll try and be quick here. So I sent all the slides to Pina, and I have a lot of links here to the original documents so that people can look at them and get the full context. The first thing is that when President Biden outlined his community violence intervention plan, he included clarification that there are 26 different federal grants that can be used for community violence initiatives. A lot of the grants in the past, people knew that they could, but had been underutilized. For some, this is brand new, but it's different agencies really across the government of ways that these programs can be used for community violence intervention and prevention programs. And it spans Department of Justice, Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, Education, Labor, all of that. And this is just a brief example. I would, have you all go to the website that I linked to before to see what the different 26 programs are, but you can see this is just the justice side of things. There's the Byrne JAG, which is program, which is $484 million a year, JAG Justice Innovation, the COPS program, Project Safe Neighborhoods. There's lots of different opportunities, but if we're not looking for them, the money's probably going to other places. I wanted to focus in on kind of 3 target places that I think are probably the most worthwhile for this committee to look at, because there is a focus on community violence. But at the same time, like I mentioned before, these span the different sectors. So just like Greg was talking about just now, about how we need the schools involved, we need housing involved, we need all sectors involved. When we're engaging these different sectors, we can go back to those lists and say, okay, what's available for education? What's available for labor? And to kind of cross-reference so that we're thinking about this health and safety in all policies type situation. So some of the biggest programs, though, these are predominantly on the justice side, is the Edward Byrne Memorial Justice Assistant Grant Program, or sometimes known as Byrne JAG. That's a $264 million annual program across the country. Project Safe Neighborhoods is $20 million annually, and Victims of Crime Assistance, or Voca, is $2.3 billion annually. Byrne JAG is very explicitly authorized to fund community violence intervention programs. For example, I know in Baltimore that one of our local governmental agencies is applying for a JAG innovation grant to do training and technical assistance to help train some of its frontline violence intervention workers right now. So that's a great place to look for, no other than the sheer size of money that is there. Project Safe Neighborhoods is somewhere that might be new to the community violence folks, but it definitely is not new to the folks that are in policing and doing things like that. And especially when you think of programs already like Project Longevity in Connecticut, that this program traditionally was used mostly for helping to fund prosecutors and evidence gathering, but with this new guidance has been a little bit more broad, so that you can think about ways that you can really get at that intersection between public health and public safety, whereas in the past it was a little bit more used mostly by prosecutors. And then lastly, Victims of Crime Assistance, Voca. There's 2 different funds that come out of Voca. So one is the Victims of Crime Compensation Program, which goes to survivors of violent crime to help make them whole after they have been victimized or injured, and funds things like medical bills, lost wages, funeral costs for families if they've been injured. So that's one half. But then the other half is for programs and groups that provide assistance to the victims themselves. So service providers now. I want to highlight Voca specifically because there's some big changes that are coming about, which I think are really, really important. It's worth noting that Voca comes from this pot of money comes from payments from criminal convictions. So predominantly it's white collar crimes. Think of your Enrons and your Volkswagens and your opioid settlements and your tobacco settlements, those really, really big ticket federal criminal prosecutions. And that's important because it's not coming from tax dollars, right? Everyone wants to know, what is my money getting spent on? This is coming from criminal convictions and not taxes. And this fund was going up from 2015 to 2018 to historic balances, but has been going down in recent years, which has been problematic because a lot of states were looking at spending additional money. And then recently the fund was kind of going down, and there's a lot of questions of, is it a good idea to spend money on new things? Luckily, the Crime Victims Fund, we're projecting that this money is going to be coming back in a more positive direction and being refilled after what was passed this summer in Congress called the Boca Fix Act. It passed the Senate 100-0, as bipartisan gets. And one of the ways that it fixes this is that it gets money into the fund from not just prosecutions and wins from the prosecutors, but also non-prosecution and deferred prosecution agreements, which had been more common recently, because you can't always make a conviction, but you can get a settlement. So it's broadening that fund of things that can go in there. But importantly for Connecticut is the Voca Fix Act also gave states flexibility in how to administer their Voca funds, which they can start immediately. So one is states can waive requirements or waive the match requirements for programs. So you have to do this. This is already the case right now during the pandemic. And then Connecticut has the option to waive this 20% match after the pandemic ends. Additionally, it allows Voca administrators to provide no-cost extensions to current recipients as we speak right now. And then third, I know this is my first bullet point, but it allows states to waive requirements that programs promote victim cooperation with law enforcement. And this is something that sounds very common sense and reasonable, but as we might imagine, actually, like when you get into the weeds, can be really, really tricky. And, as Greg mentioned, when he was in the hospital, he was trying to, survive and get his life, get to surgery and get to the next day. And that wasn't necessarily a moment where interacting with law enforcement made sense in his, in his state of health. But unfortunately, we know for law enforcement officers, it's really hard work, right? And they're trying to, figure out who did it and get the conviction and try and track that down. So law enforcement officers, their priority in that moment is to try and make the connection to figure out who did it. And especially, if maybe there was another shooting planned that night. So law enforcement officers are trying to make that case. But what can be difficult is when you have that time-sensitive situation where Greg might say, hey, not right now, I got to go to surgery and I don't know what's going on with my life. But what we found is that for individual survivors of violence, it may come down to a checkbox with that detective of, did the survivor cooperate? And yes or no. And perhaps Greg would be interested in cooperating after his surgery or next week or next month, but sometimes it's just not in the case that you can do it at that moment. So this is why I think this is actually very, very important, but not something that I have time to really get into right at this moment. There are some challenges with these 26 different programs, right? So there is an onus on the communities and the programs to actively monitor these grant announcements. So there's no automated mechanism or system to automatically, notify places. But the upside is that there are nonprofits and advocacy organizations that are building out these web tools as we speak. In fact, I got a email just this morning from a group that asked me to take a look at it. So just something to plug that, hopefully this will be coming soon. But I think this actually goes to Greg and Oswad's point just now about the power of having a point person on this, is having one person or one organization that their job is to do violence prevention. They can look at all of those 26, different grant programs and have a calendar to look at it. Whereas, a local nonprofit, that might be really, really difficult. A good resource that I found for this is from Giffords Law Center. They did a report on reimagining federal funding to imagine community violence. I just put this as a reference there for folks to take a look at. And then Medicaid, let's jump into Medicaid real quick here. I see we're at 3:02. Some of you might ask, hey, we passed a law in Connecticut just this last session that authorizes Medicaid reimbursement for violence prevention services. Why are we covering it? Didn't we already do it? Well, the answer is, well, that was just the start. And the state is still implementing this and figuring it out. And on top of that, the governor needs to make sure it's in the budget to make it work. And the governor has a lot of latitude to making it either broad or narrow in scope. So this is something that continually needs to get worked on. And on top of that, because Medicaid is one of the biggest line items in any given state budget, it's a topic that you'll have to look at every year because budgets are tight and the state of Connecticut needs to balance their budget every year. So it's something that will always need to be looked at. So briefly, one of the reasons this came about is that the federal government and Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services announced earlier this year that yes, Medicaid can be used for violence prevention services. And they did a webinar and put out a toolkit to show about a dozen different ways that states can use this. And if you look at the bottom of this link here, I put a link to that toolkit. And of course, Connecticut moved forward. You've got our chairman here, Mr. Woods, and then the governor and the lieutenant governor here, along with us all signing it into law. And so this is something that's in process. But briefly, Medicaid, we got to remember, it is a health insurance program, right? It's a partnership between the federal government and the state government, and it generally covers pregnant women, children, low-income individuals. And it is one of the biggest health insurers across the nation. So people usually think of Medicare because it's something we've known about for a long time. But it turns out there's more people on Medicaid than Medicare across the nation. And its annual budget is huge, $613 billion across the nation. So it's something that we shouldn't forget about. And for violently injured patients, it is a lifeline. The way that the demographics of violence and gunshot wounds plays out, it turns out that about 2/3 of violently injured patients are either Medicaid patients or uninsured. And I need to give a shout out. This citation for this is coming from one of your researchers at Yale, Dr. Edward Coupe, who did this research himself. So hat tip to him. Medicaid is flexible. Your state has lots of flexibility in how to administer this. So like I mentioned before, as the state is figuring out exactly how to do this and like how big are the benefit and how robust, they've got some room to make those decisions. And the reason we're talking about this is that it is a big opportunity to provide trauma-informed care for survivors of violence or those at risk of violence or those who have witnessed violence. there are lots of benefits for the programs themselves. I think I know I just did hospital-based violence intervention programs. That was just me out of habit as the hospital-based violence intervention person, but I don't want to mean it to say that it excludes trauma recovery centers or intimate partner violence or domestic violence. Covers all of those, so that's a typo on my point. But for the folks that are doing that frontline work, it acknowledges the value of what they're doing. It provides job security for these folks because, like we mentioned, funding is always hard, and it flips this idea of the frontline workers as cost centers, which is false and derogatory and not true, and it flips it up so that they're bringing in money so that it helps provide some job security. And then it diversifies the funding stream for the violence prevention programs, because we know that it doesn't make sense for any single one funding stream to be able to cover everything. So, like I mentioned before, I think I said this 3 times already, the scope and size of the reimbursement is going to be highly dependent on the programs that you're using in the state. So the way that you use it might be slightly different for domestic violence or intimate partner violence versus community violence versus how you're doing things at trauma recovery centers or street outreach, things like that. So just worth mentioning. And then lastly, I just wanted to, try and get some creative thinking out there. Are there opportunities in this infrastructure bill that the president, I'm told, is going to sign into law on Monday? And I think the answer is yes. I think there are. So there's some very good research. This was done out of Philadelphia by Dr. Smith that looked at how the physical environment interacts with community violence. And this was an op-ed that she published in the New York Times that said, to combat gun violence, clean up the neighborhood. This is something that she did. She lives in West Philadelphia in the communities that she serves. And she did research that looked at structural housing repair in her neighborhood and crime. And they found that when they did these targeted investments in structural repairs, that it decreased crime. And they did things like cleaning up abandoned buildings in abandoned lots, cleaning it up to do community gardens, adding murals and things like that. And there was a huge reduction. So, when the federal government is saying, hey, we're going to pay for roads and bridges and, different built environment in Hartford and Bridgeport and some of these cities, I think of ways that you can hit multiple different strategic outcomes. So not just what is a road that can be repaired, but how can that road or that abandoned lot also, where does it map up with community violence so that you can do it and hit multiple different outcomes at the same time and really maximize those dollars being spent. And then lastly, there's $15 billion in the infrastructure bill for lead abatement. We know that this is lead exposure in childhood is a risk factor for violence later on in life. It's actually one of the theories between why we had the great crime decline in the 1990s was because decades earlier, there was the removal of lead from gasoline. So this is something where it's in the infrastructure bill. There is money going out to replace lead service lines. So looking at those mappings of, are there lead pipes in the communities where there are violence? And the odds are yes, because we know that those lead service lines are disproportionately in older houses that are in Black and brown communities that disproportionately bear the brunt of community violence. I think it makes sense to look at where this money is going and try and get it to those communities. Are you going to see those results next week? No, you're not. Are you going to get any credit for it? No, you're not. The credit is going to, come 15, 20, 30 years in the future, but it's still the right thing to do. And then this is just a research paper from up in, I think it was Pittsburgh, where they looked at the juvenile justice system and looked at kids that on paper, they look exactly the same. They have the same, family income levels, the same races, same education, same all of that. But you look at one group has lead in the household, other group does not. And the kids that were exposed to lead were more likely to be involved in the juvenile justice system than those that weren't. So data that shows that, sometimes public health is about thinking of the things that might not be, the most flashy, and it might be a little bit boring, but it's a good way to do it. So thank you.
Right.
312, but
that's all right, Cal, I want to thank you. It's fine that it's 312. Your members on the committee hung around, the bulk of them, and we obviously got it recorded, and it's also going into the record. And I tell you, you've given us more than, quite frankly, some things that as close as I work with you on knowing some of the work and some of the things you've uncovered, you've elevated some other areas of interest that I think benefits us greatly. So folks, we don't have time for any questions at this time, but I do want to remind folks that our next meeting is scheduled for November 23rd from 10 to 12 p.m. And again, folks, please get to Pina and myself, but primarily the Pina, if you're interested in testifying at the next public hearing. And so folks, I hope and pray that everyone has a safe and wonderful weekend, and we'll adjourn the meeting.